All right, welcome back. From the last video, you should have ended up with something like this. So we should now see this code file in the upper left window. We don't really know what it is yet, but we'll talk about that now. And so the easiest way to kind of navigate this file, I think at least, is to go to this bottom line in this bottom left or in this top left window. And then if you click the little arrows, you'll be able to kind of navigate through the different sections of the file pretty easily. And so we've actually already covered this intro to RStudio in the previous video, even though we didn't have the file. And so we're going to navigate to this what are RStudio and R Markdown. And so the distinction between the three will definitely become a lot more clear later on. But R is a statistical software that kind of runs all of the code in the background, and it's used a lot for data analysis. I think for doing data analysis, the top two languages that I at least think of are R and Python. And so we'll be using R throughout this course. RStudio, you could think of it as just like a user interface for R. It's not really that, but it's just a nice kind of way to like have this file panel in the lower right window and kind of have some of these other things that we'll talk about later. R Markdown is something that we'll use also very, very heavily. And so this .rmd file, that does stand for R Markdown, so RMD. And what R Markdown does is let us have a file that has both like Microsoft Word style text and code. And so up to this point, we're just seeing the kind of Microsoft Word-ish style text. We haven't seen any code yet, but we'll see that in a second. And so this R Markdown file, this .rmd, when you click knit like we did in the last video, it creates this .html file. So these two files are like the same thing. This one just looks pretty after it's knitted, but it has the same exact text as this R Markdown does. So I could scroll down to where we're reading right now, what is RStudio and R Markdown. I'm going to recommend that you follow along with the .rmd file instead of trying to jump back and forth. First, just because I think it's easier to not jump back and forth between the two, and second, I think it'll help help us all kind of get used to this .rmd file and navigating it and what exactly it can do. Okay. And I think this is kind of the last preliminary topic before we start talking about data. And so throughout this course, we're gonna use this R package that's called the tidyverse. And I kind of put in here that you could think of an R package as, like, if you're into gaming or video games, it's kind of like DLC, like downloadable content. So it's something that's extra to R, but unlike most gaming DLCs, the tidyverse is heavily, heavily used, and so we're going to use it a ton. And it actually contains 8 different core packages. And so if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see them all listed. ggplot2, that's what we would have covered a little bit of in Stat 213 for plotting, and then the rest are kind of listed. So dplyr, tidyr, reader, tibble, stringer, forcats, and per-r. We will get to all of these, which is super exciting, except per-r, which is super sad, but there's just not quite enough time to make it to that one. All right, And so getting to the code part of this file, we're gonna change an option first. And so if you go to tools up here and then global options and then down to R Markdown, and we're going to uncheck this show output inline for all R Markdown documents because I hate it and it's awful. No, some people must like it because it's the default. But I'll show you what that does once we get to our first code chunk. But for now, just click apply and then click OK. Okay, and so the very first code chunk we're going to get to, if you scroll down a little bit, is a code chunk that's going to load in this tidyverse library that's going to let us do a lot of cool stuff. And so you could see that the background for a code chunk is this kind of light gray, whereas the background for regular kind of Microsoft Word style text is white. And so that's how we can kind of differentiate what's code and what's not. What's code also opens with this kind of special thing to let it know, so we can tell R that, oh, what's coming up is actually code that you have to run. How you can run code is you would put your cursor in the line that has code. So in this case, it's my line 95 that has the code. And you could click this run button. And you would run the selected line. You should see something appear in your bottom left hand window. So you should see this library tidyverse appear, and you should see that it's attaching all of these packages. And so it's just letting you know that it's loading all of these packages. These are all the ones that we had just talked about that were listed a couple minutes ago. It's also letting you know that there's a couple conflicts that we're not going to talk about quite yet. But if you get kind of this message, that means you're good to go. How I'd recommend you run code in the future is, instead of using this clunky run button, if you put your cursor in the line that has code in it, if you're on a Mac, you could press Command Enter and it would run. For a PC, you would press Control Enter and it'll run the line. So when I rerun it, it doesn't reprint the messages, but that's fine. You should still see it in your bottom left window. Okay, so that was kind of our first line of code that we've run in this class. If you want to insert a code chunk on like a new code chunk for yourself, you would click this insert button, and then you'll see a bunch of other languages, like Python's in there, SQL's in there, and then some other ones, like this one's a little bit more R specific, but we're always going to insert R code chunks. And so the very first thing is R. You'll kind of see this gray background appear. And what we're going to do in this first code chunk is just do a simple kind of numerical calculation of 99 plus 10. So if you type that in and then hit Command or Control Enter, you should see the result of that calculation appear in your bottom left-hand window. And so you could do any number of kind of basic arithmetic calculations, like 7 divided by 2, maybe 7 times whatever that number is. And so R can work just like a basic calculator, and that's kind of its simplest use. Okay, so basic calculator, not super exciting still. I'm anxious and chomping at the bit to get to data. And so for the next video, we will start talking about alcohol data. I did want to mention before we end the video that if you have issues with any of this, definitely email me right away. It's probably something that can be fixed pretty quickly. And so I really don't, I, I guess it's going to be frustrating a little bit no matter what when you start learning a new language, but I don't want anyone to become overly frustrated. And so feel free to ask me if you get stuck, and so that way you could get unstuck and move on to the cool stuff of looking at alcohol data and athlete data. All right, have a good afternoon, everyone.